to discuss a bit more about what is happening today in Afghanistan. I'm very pleased to be joined on the programme by Hameed Hakimi. He's a research associate at Chatham House. Thanks for joining us today on France 24, sir. First of all, I want to talk to you about the scale of this Taliban offensive. There is a report today from the United States, security figures there, saying that the Taliban could isolate Kabul in 30 days and take it in 90 days. Is that plausible in your view?
I mean, if we look at the way that they've progressed, and if we continue to see the same level of progress on the Taliban side and nothing changing from the Afghan government side, I think that's plausible. We've seen, as you rightly pointed out, the number of provinces falling to the Taliban last week only. But again, these military estimations are quite very much based on daily events, and daily events are quite fluid. So the situation, whatever way you look at it, is quite uncertain, and the Taliban are certainly with the highest morale here.
Yeah, it's clear that Joe Biden, at least publicly, does not regret pulling out American troops. But it is clear that since the US and the NATO withdrawal, the Taliban have made huge progress. In your view, was that decision to withdraw Western troops this year a mistake?
I don't personally have a problem with the American troops being withdrawn. I've worked for years in Afghanistan, and I know that overall the majority of the country did not like the occupation of a foreign military force of their country. But let's rewind a little bit. Why did this whole thing begin? Because the United States and a huge number of Western allied countries did a military invasion in Afghanistan in 2001, forcibly removing the Taliban, not at the request of the Afghans, but because that's what the United States foreign policy and a domestic mood at the time dictated. So with regard to the removal and invasion in the first place, it had nothing to do with Afghanistan's or Afghans' views on that. But I think in the way, in the kind of the heedlessness, the recklessness with which the Biden administration has gone about doing this, I don't believe that they haven't calculated whatever humanitarian cost we see now of this hasty withdrawal on the ground. But I believe that with the Biden administration, they just wanted a political cutoff of the kind of narratives that developed around this conflict within the United States, the idea of the so-called, forever war in the United States. So with all of that, I think it's fair to say that perhaps the Biden administration is comfortable with whatever cost to the humanitarian lives of Afghans, this kind of heedless military withdrawal does. And kind of last point on this, I don't think anybody in Afghanistan wanted a permanent presence of the NATO troops, not certainly the ordinary people. But in the manner that the United States have done this, with handing over the momentum to the Taliban and then telling the Afghan government and the people to resist the Taliban, I think that's very disingenuous and reckless, at least.
Now, you call that reckless, and several times now you've mentioned the humanitarian situation in parts of Afghanistan that are now under Taliban control. I note that today we've heard that Germany is one of the countries that will no longer be deporting people to Afghanistan because of the scale of the humanitarian crisis in the country. Could you sketch it out for us? What's it like for people living in regions that have recently found themselves being controlled by the Taliban?
I think the language is very important. So the notion of being under the Taliban control or the Afghan government control does not necessarily mean that one is more violent than the other. It's the clashes that happen, it's the fighting over territory that really harms the civilians. So when I say that the humanitarian cost, I mean the conflict, the way it's escalating right now, not necessarily whichever party controls more territory. But coming to your question, there are 3.5 to 4 million Afghans internally displaced within the country. These are predominantly Afghans with big families, children, women, elderly, who have had to escape their homes because of conflict. And then there's also recent figures from the UN agencies that shows that up to 30 to 40,000 Afghans are leaving the country per week to leave and find sanctuary westward towards Iran and Turkey and further into Europe. So the situation is dire. The push factors from Afghanistan of these serious conflict, serious insecurity, and a threat to people's lives is real. And with all of that, you already had a situation where humanitarian conditions were bad. The environmental degradation of Afghanistan is real. People were already living under poverty line, up to 50% of the population. So you combine all of that and you get a very implosive situation, and one for which I think the whole world will be responsible if they don't intervene and they don't try and speed up and support the political process which is needed to end this war politically.